Hello, I'm Stephen Kerr. I'm a trustee of Freedom Declared Foundation. I'm also, I should declare, a member of the Scottish Parliament. And Freedom Declared Foundation is a charity which has been set up to promote and foster the fundamental freedom of religion or belief that is encapsulated in Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This is the second in a series of webinars that we're running that considers the impact of COVID on this fundamental human right of freedom of religion or belief in the United Kingdom. This one that we're doing now is about the United Kingdom. We're going to consider the short and longer term impacts of the restrictions that government introduced in the wake of the pandemic. And joining me in this webinar, I'm really thrilled to be joined by three exceptional people that I'm looking forward to hearing from in the course of the next hour or so. I'd like, first of all, to introduce Lois McLatchie. Lois is a communications officer for the Alliance for Defending Freedom UK, which is a human rights group, and was involved in supporting Canon Tom White's legal challenge to the Scottish Government's worship ban, which was introduced in March last year. And Lois advocates for fundamental freedoms, including freedom of religion or belief, and is involved with the media right across the UK and further afield. And we're just delighted that she's with us today. She's a legal analyst on the ADF's international UN advocacy team at the Human Rights Council in Geneva, and is joining us today from, Lois, you're in Vienna though, aren't you?
I'm in Vienna. My previous role was a legal analyst at the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva, but I now do a lot of media and speak out in the press about freedom of religion and belief and other fundamental freedoms. So Canon Tom's case is one that particularly caught my attention, and I was excited to participate today on that information.
And Lois is joining us, as I say, from Vienna, which is really good. And I should make it clear in terms of academic qualifications, she's an MA in International Relations and an LLM in Human Rights Law, and with distinction as well in that respect. I'm also absolutely delighted to be joined by my friend Imam Sayed Razawi. Sayed is the Chief Imam and Director General of the Scottish Alul Bayt Society. He's also an advocate and director at Harvard University's Weatherhead Centre for International Affairs, as well as being a visiting scholar at the University of Strathclyde. And he has served on the UK's Independent Sharia Review, which was commissioned by Theresa May, and participates as a member of the Oxfam's GB Zakat Advisory Panel. He's also a trustee for Faith for Climate. Sayed is a trustee and member of many international organizations and non-governmental bodies, including an international trustee of Religions for Peace, and a member of the European Council of Religious Leaders, and a member of the UN Multi-Faith Advisory Council, and an advisory board member of the Islamic Reporting Initiative. And I should also mention he is a member of the advisory board of Freedom Declared Foundation. Sayed, you're joining us today from London. You're down in London.
I am, for the time being.
Yeah, we hope to see you in Scotland again soon. But we're delighted to have you with us and recognise that you are a fellow of great distinction, and we're greatly honoured to have you with us today as well. As we are indeed my third guest, who I'm delighted to introduce, Rabbi Herschel Gluck OBE. Rabbi Gluck Herschel, I'm going to call him during the course of our webinar today. He's given me permission to do so. Is involved in so many charitable works across the UK, Europe, and the Middle East. He is a spiritual mentor of European Jewish students. He's a founding member of the Polish Rabbinical Commission. He's a chairman and founder of the Muslim Jewish Forum, and I think that's where, in a number of different ways, Herschel and Sayed have gotten to know each other. So they've been in various places together, traveling companions and so forth. I would say that we should also mention that Herschel is chairman of the Arab Jewish Forum and was made an OBE in 2013 for the work that he's been doing in the field of freedom of religion or belief. Rabbi Herschel Gluck. Where are you joining us from this today?
London.
From London as well?
Yeah.
Well, so we've
My
got a connection.
apologies.
No, you don't need to apologize for speaking from London.
Actually, my father is from Vienna, so I feel connected on
Oh,
all
Very
levels.
nice.
Oh, that's excellent. We're
Yes,
all
and he
interconnected.
came over in 1938. I'll let you guess why. So this is
Yeah.
something very connected to what we are discussing this morning.
Absolutely. Yes, it is. In a very serious vein, that is absolutely correct. But yeah, tremendous to be here with you, all three of you. And I want us to feel relaxed about talking to one another as friends, because we are in fact friends, and that makes this webinar so much easier to process. Let me first of all turn to the restrictions. I mean, the pandemic hit us all March last year. In the UK, government restrictions came pretty quickly right across the UK, and some of those restrictions impacted very heavily on churches. What was the impact for you and from your perspective on faith groups as a result of the imposition of these restrictions? Let me start with Syed. Syed, what happened last March?
I think it's a very complex question, but I'm going to try and unpack it to the best of my ability. I think what happened was something which is unprecedented, something that's not been seen before. It's a new phenomenon, 1400 years of Islam. So here we are in a position whereby every mosque technically has to close down, both in Scotland and England, so across the UK. So you have an issue here immediately on two fronts. Firstly, how do we worship? Because we obviously have congregational prayers, which are slightly different from the Christian churches in terms of the laws and regulations of congregational prayer. But then secondly, you've got those people who have spent all of their life in the mosque, and they feel that not going to the mosque is going to lead to other complications such as depression, anxiety, which it did. The elders of the community, that was their, you could say, club where they would go 5 times a day to socialize. So it was much more than just a place of worship. So you've got quality of living, standard of living, which is being affected, implications on mental health. And within all of that, we have to make a decision as to what to do. And I guess the community in Scotland were very good at trying to balance the restrictions, not trying to cause too much of a fuss. Because from our position, Islamophobia is already quite rampant across the UK. So many believe that if we were to say something, it would lead to an exacerbation of Islamophobia to say that here, Muslims are going to protesting. So the natural inclination for my community, at least in Scotland, was to shut up and sit down and just to obey laws and regulations as they're coming forward. And though there was a bit of a protest from some of the elders to say, well, look, we're in the last stages of our lives. We'd rather go socialize and pray. But eventually they came to a conclusion that it's better just to sit down quietly and not say anything. So, and that, I believe, was purely because of the fact that they didn't want any ramifications on a wider level, because you could see some of the messaging coming from the media. You could see other segments of society blaming faith for the spread of COVID. We saw across the world, for example, parts of India whereby particular religious festivals had led to criticism of religious groups. And so because of which we found ourselves in a position last March as to how to steer things forward. And I think we made the right decision in terms of, at the time, to assist the best that we could for the government, both in Scotland and Westminster, to be able to implement their laws so that our community felt protected. And I guess here's a balance comes into play. Protection in terms of against Islamophobia, or you could say suspension of religious belief or religious practice. And we came to the conclusion that at this moment in time, the most important thing is to protect the community from Islamophobia, because through the conditions that we have within our law, if there is going to be any attack on the person or the reputation of the faith, then what takes precedence is you follow the rules initially. So though things developed, the decision, let's close everything down, let's sit in our homes, and let's see what the next month, 2 months has in play. So that was the situation this time last March.
And that's interesting that you talk about how Islamophobia played such a part in bringing everyone, as it were, in line with the restrictions. That was a consideration. That's really, Herschel, I mean, we're only too well aware of the anti-Semitic stuff that's going on all around us as well, sadly. What was the response in your community?
It was similar. And there were very strong feelings that one's human rights were being deeply compromised, because we live in a time when external factors are taken into consideration. And I think it's very important to take external matters into consideration, as far as color of skin is concerned, as far as gender is concerned. But there has been a total ignoring of what's going on in our hearts, what's going on in our minds, what's going on in our soul. And those are the basic arenas of human rights. The right of conscience, the right of religion, the right of feeling. But sadly, there are those who are fundamentally dogmatic. And I think Iran would feel embarrassed by the dogmatism of the secular establishment, who feel that they have the only truth and everyone has to go along with their perspective and with their view. It's something which goes against the very grain of human rights. I'm jumping in the deep end, as you can see.
Carry on. It's very interesting.
And I think that when it came to closing of houses of worship, I'm not going in if it was right or wrong. And as you might know, I was very, very vocal in my support of what was being said. But on the other hand, I think the people who implemented it had no sensitivity at all to the meaning of religion, to the meaning of faith, to the meaning of religious practice, to believers. And they rode roughshod over the issues which lie at the very core of the human experience of these people, of us. And as we've seen recently, that that 60,000 people are allowed to pack into a stadium for a football match, when 30 people can't get together to pray in the house of worship. So that intimates that these people do not have the basic literacy in understanding what religion is, what religion means to people, and what human rights are. And therefore, I think we need to have a total revamp of society, that people should be able to understand the rights of others and what religion means to the vast majority of people on this planet.
Herschel, that is, I mentioned at the beginning that Sayed was an advisor of Freedom Declared. You're also an advisor of Freedom Declared, and that passion that you have just shared with us is fantastic. I mean, we're going to talk a lot about what you have introduced us to in your opening contribution. Two superb opening contributions. I'm now going to turn to a third fabulous opening contribution to Lois. Lois, you have a more generic view give us your impression of the impact these restrictions had as you saw them from your advantage point as a human rights specialist.
Yeah, and I want to draw a lot from what Rabbi Herschel has just said, in that I do believe it was forgotten or dismissed that freedom of religion is not just a hobby, it is a fundamental human right, more so than, say, to go shopping is not a human right, although it was something that was taken away from us and it's something that we enjoy, but it's not a human right. But going to church, to synagogue, to mosque, that is a practice of a human right. And that was definitely dismissed from the very start of the pandemic. Now, there are arguments made to say that, at the start of the pandemic, the government were hit with something they had no idea what to do. They never had a situation like this before. And that was, the start of the extreme kind of shutdown on religious practice. But what should never have happened is the question of not ignoring the part of the law which requires proportionality. Now, we've talked about UDHR, Article 18, but the European Convention on Human Rights is binding in the UK and across all the home nations. And in Article 9, freedom of religion and belief is protected and can only be impacted or withheld if it is necessary and proportionate. Now, a blanket ban on worship, which happened at the very start of the pandemic across the UK and later on in Scotland as a repetition, a blanket ban can never really be proportionate, can it? Because what if we have a small church with 3 people on a mountainside who've never been in contact with COVID? Would it be proportionate for them to suddenly shut down for months at a time in the same way that a city would have restrictions? So from the very start, there was not a lens put on this of protecting freedom of religion and belief as a really important, cherished human right. And like the rabbi said, and this is something that Canon Tom White pointed out in his press statements as well, is that we're not just here to protect physical health, which is very important, but it's also mental and spiritual health. And so you mentioned that as well. And those things are ultimately really, really important. And I think from the very start, that outlook was not adopted.
Lois, are you saying that government overstepped the mark?
I do believe in the in blanket shutdowns, there was no proportionality or necessity applied there. Now, obviously, there was a problem, and we did have to have that discussion and think about ways that we could keep people safe whilst they were attending church. And I think and other places of worship, and even Chris Whitty in November, who was very involved in making a lot of the decisions and on COVID restrictions, said that places of worship were willing to comply with alterations, with distancing, with masking, with cleansing, all the rest. So an absolute blanket ban on worship, which was in place in Scotland at the start of the year and in England at the start of the pandemic, yeah, that is an overstep, a disproportionate move.
And what does that tell us about the understanding? I mean, Herschel mentioned this in his contribution. What does it tell us about the understanding that government, I'm going to use the term, generic term, government, that government has about the importance of this fundamental human right, the importance of religion in the lives of millions of the citizens of this country? What does it tell us?
Yeah, it was undermining, wasn't it? It did show that whilst other human rights are cherished and protected, freedom of religion and belief, perhaps because maybe it's not a majority of people who hold it, or maybe it's not as outspoken as others, but it was treated as a kind of a second-class human right by those standards. So I was very pleased to see in Scotland, where the court victory of Canon Tom White and the 27 other faith leaders, that has set a precedent to show that when the government does undermine religious freedom, there is going to be people who are upset and will stand up for their human rights, and the court will protect. And that precedent is very important for Scotland. But unfortunately, the same precedent has not been achieved yet in England. Court cases were not successful at overturning a disproportionate ban there, which means that there's no guarantee that next time we face a crisis, there won't be a subsequent follow-on which undermines religious freedom again.
Lois, I'm going to turn to Sayed, because I mentioned at the beginning that Sayed had served on a commission. Theresa May asked him to be on a review commission, Sharia, the independent Sharia review. So I'm going to quote Theresa May, Sayed, and ask you to comment on this quote. She said, and this was in the House of Commons, "My concern is that the government today making it illegal to conduct an act of public worship for the best of intentions sets a precedent that could be misused for a government of the future for the worst of intentions. So, Syed, the precedent has been set, or has it been avoided? What's your take?
I think she's right in her analysis. She's a person of faith, so she's obviously looking at it from a basis of faith. And I'd say that I guess it's been an evolution of interpretation. So from the very beginning of the pandemic, I think that religion may not have had that position that it does now. We've seen over the last year and a half or so that religious communities have played quite a vital role in helping in this crisis. But I completely agree with what she's saying, that it can be taken out of context, and you could have more draconian laws come into play in the future if something like this is allowed to happen, and it was allowed to happen. So we don't know how we're going to go forward either with this, with Article 18 and Article 9. So both of these agreements, whether it's the ECHR or whether it's the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as we go forward, as we know that there's going to be curbs to this. There is conversation going on. So though that these rights were something that we were meant to have upheld a year and a half ago, and they were open to interpretation, as we go forward, there is a distinct policy that we could have a lot of that either scrapped, modified, edited, and so forth as we move forward. So if we've had a problem a year and a half ago, the question is what kind of problems can come as we go forward? In terms of interpretation, as you've just heard, the idea of proportionality. But if we're having an issue already on this, then if we don't have these checks and balances in place, then what happens? So I think she's completely right in her analysis that if we do go for 5 years from now, if we won't be part of the ECHR, it's possible that certain rights within the Universal Declaration may be suspended. How do we then go forward? If there is a crisis that takes place, what guarantee do we have that people are allowed to worship? Because I guess the ultimate aim of Article 18 was freedom of thought, consciousness, and religion. And unfortunately, that manifestation was curbed, at least in England. You know, there was a bit of a discussion in Scotland, but in England, there's been a blanket shutdown. And so coming back to it, I think she's right. I think she's right in her analysis. I don't think it's coming only from a place of a person who's a believer, but I think in a faith, but I think it is an observation, which is a universal observation. So there's legs to what she's saying. How do we go forward if we're already in this particular situation where we have these checks and balances in place and the issues come down to interpretation of proportionality? How do we go forward?
In your opening remarks, you talked about, I think quite movingly actually, the vulnerability that the Muslim community in the UK feels in terms of the Islamophobia that you touched on, that has recently again been the subject of a report that was published in Scotland, that Anna Sawar, the Scottish Labour leader, wrote a very, again, moving piece in one of our national newspapers in Scotland about this. I mean, what is it? Let's talk about what this sense of vulnerability combined with what you've just described. What does it tell you about the way that government viewed religion at the beginning of the pandemic? Syed.
I think religion has been in the position of advising, but I guess over the decades or so, it's been more of a tick box exercise as opposed to being a partner within the mechanics of the system. But I guess over the last year and a half, there has been a shift, a subtle shift. And as the power of religion or religious communities has come to light, I think that it's got more of a say than it may have done in March. So there's been more consultations, there's been discussions. And, you know, here I would like to, again, separate, because there is a distinct difference. I was part of both strategies, both in England and in Scotland. And I felt that the Scottish, you could say, response to religious communities has been more positive as opposed to the English. So I think within England, there was more of a dictation taking place, whereas within Scotland, there was actually a proper consultation whereby on a weekly basis, you'd have 2 debriefs. And unfortunately, that wasn't taking place in England. So there is a marked separation as to, I guess, the culture of religion in both parts of the country, you could say, or the United Kingdom. So, we have more of an emphasis now, I guess, on religious communities, but we're very far behind. So looking at it from a Muslim perspective, already we have issues of Islamophobia. The two things that we thought would help us are the ECHR and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, both of which seem to have been open to interpretation. And so what happens is that it builds anxiety. So the community is more anxious. They're feeling under threat. They may feel going forward, if any of these articles are repealed in any shape or form, that we actually don't have any more rights. So when a community feels insular, or let's say feels that they're vulnerable, then what happens? Well, as been seen in the past, migration takes place. You may have migration that takes place of people, as has been seen in parts of Europe, people coming into the UK, people going to Canada, people going to the United States. And I remember having a conversation not too long ago with, in fact, two members of the Conservative Party, who both of them were peers, one Jewish, one Muslim, who both came to the conclusion that perhaps some of us may need to go to Dubai and the others may need to go to New York. So, when you have that kind of a conversation taking place, I think it's worrying times. That is
very worrying. Herschel, you talked about secularism and the expression of secularism, particularly at the beginning of the pandemic, in the way that these restrictions were, in a disproportionate way, Lois has highlighted that, were introduced across the board. In what is a secular society, the hierarchy of freedoms, where does freedom of religion or belief, do you think, fit into their hierarchy of human rights?
That's a very good question. And I'd like to preface my comments, starting with a lady who was born in Scotland and had very proud and deep Scottish roots, and that is the Queen Mother. Some of us of the older generation might remember her. I remember that after she passed away, on the first day of her lying in state, I was in Whitehall speaking to a senior civil servant, and he was looking outside the window and saw this long queue of people waiting to file pass and express their respects to the Queen Mother. And he couldn't believe his empirical view. He couldn't believe that there were so many people who actually cared about the monarchy, who cared about this lady, that they were prepared on the workday to take off time and pay her respect. And I think this is symptomatic of the disconnect between the Whitehall Westminster bubble and the people of the UK. The people of the UK are, to a great degree, deeply religious, most frequently on a private basis, but any of us who have mixed with the people of the UK are aware of a deeply held religious faith and belief. In Whitehall and Westminster, there's a bubble which is generally a secular bubble and isn't in touch with the heartbeat of British society, in many, especially in as far as faith and religion is concerned. And that disconnect was very much in evidence during the deliberations regarding the shutting down of religious buildings. Because, as Lois said before and as Sayed mentioned, there is an ignorance, there is insensitivity to the human right, which is a basic human right in the UN Charter, in the European Charter of religious freedom, of the right to practice religion, not just the religious freedom to think, but to practice religion, which that is another element And I think that we need to reflect upon this element very, very deeply and find a constructive way forward to bring about change.
Absolutely. And we're going to turn our attention to that in a moment. But before we do that, Herschel, thank you for that contribution. I want to go back to Lois, because we've mentioned a couple of times the distinction between England and Scotland, and Sayed's been very generous because he knows I'm a Scot. He's been talking about the differences between Scotland and England in a positive light in terms of Scottish sensitivities. But in fact, in Scotland, a group of faith leaders ended up taking the Scottish government to court. And Lois, you were at the centre of all of that. What's the significance of that court action that you were involved with?
Yeah, that was a very, very interesting case to be involved with. Now, Canon Tom White is a Glasgow priest. He's from a very underprivileged area of Glasgow, actually. And he felt that his faith community needed their church. He was looking around, he saw, and to put in context what Herschel was saying, that this right was undermined. Bicycle shops were open in Scotland, off licenses were open in Scotland. People could go to all sorts of other public places and businesses. So obviously there was an economic interest in keeping some places open, but Canon Tom's community and faith communities across Scotland could not go to worship their God in their place of worship. And so he mounted a challenge. We were able to support him as ADF UK, and he took the government to court, to the highest court in Edinburgh, and legally challenged under judicial review the worship ban that was put in place. And he was joined by 27 other faith leaders from across Scotland in doing so. So they were, and I think what I really noticed about that as well was there was a lot of public support for these faith leaders, not only from faith communities, but from wider afield. People started to see that, well, even if I'm not religious, I understand that human rights are all important. And if we're coming after one human right, we have to protect it because they're protected as a whole. So it was very encouraging to see. And fortunately, the court ruled that the blanket ban on worship that the Scottish government had put in place had been indeed unlawful and disproportionate. And that set a fantastic precedent. It means that the next time there is a pandemic, the next time there's any sort of crisis in Scotland, there won't be able to just snap on a blanket ban as they did last time with very little debate or time for discussion about that. They will have to respect that precedent that was laid down by the court and make sure that things are done much more fairly, proportionately, and in accordance with the law. So it's very, very encouraging to see.
You were right. I mean, for example, the judge specifically, one of the judges specifically called out, in contrast, the practice of housing jury centres in cinemas. With the fact that you couldn't attend church. You could effectively go to the cinema, which was being used for some other purpose, admittedly, but the idea of closing places of worship was in direct contravention of that. Go on, Lois.
That's right. No, the interesting point about that is that the government had argued that that was okay because it was in protection of Article 6, the right to a fair trial. And so the judge was able to say, okay, protect Article 6, but what about Article 9 of the ECHR, the freedom of religion and belief? And they could not find a way to justify that they had gone to great lengths to protect a fair trial, but not the right to freely worship. And so that was a really winning argument for the court.
And Lord Braid, in his judgment, did say that the Scottish government had admittedly paid lip service to Article 9 that you just referred to, and they had paid lip service to it by referring to it. So it's perhaps, and I say this as a politician, perhaps politicians are guilty of speaking about things and therefore thinking that they are in there, because they've been spoken of, that they are in effect. But that's not the case. And he went on, but there is no evidence, speaking of the Scottish government, that they have accorded it the importance which such a fundamental right deserves. This was very late on in the pandemic, Lois, when this action finally took place. I mean, I think it was, when was the hearing at the court session?
The hearing was at the end of February. We had a result early March.
Yeah, I mean, there are a number of things that concern me about the church's response and government's response, church and faith groups' response to the pandemic, and the government's response to closing places of worship. I'm going to turn to back to Sayed and Herschel here, because one of the things that concerned me as a Christian was the fact that there seemed to be great store about easing restrictions in time for things like Christmas. Christmas was a big deal last year. Christmas, we were going to have a free-for-all. Do you remember? And it was all suspended pretty much on Christmas Eve. No, you can't go and see your family. No, you can't have a turkey dinner. And it was a big thing about Christmas. And then again, there was a big thing about the timing of the easing of restrictions around Easter. It felt to me as a Christian that this was grossly insensitive, because there was no suggestion about easing restrictions for Passover or Ramadan, for example. I mean, can I just ask Sayed to comment on that? I mean, that probably enhanced this feeling of insecurity that we don't want people to feel about freedom of religion or belief in the United Kingdom, but which your community in particular, you've referenced this several times this morning in our webinar, was feeling.
Well, firstly, just to say, I'm also a Scotsman with English roots. So you're not the only Scotsman on this.
Good.
But no, you know,
we're all in this together, all these Scots.
We are all in this together. But I think your question is very leading. You know exactly what you want me to answer on that.
Yeah, I do, because
exactly.
It was so revealing.
It is, but look, what can you do? So, you know, look, maybe you could look at it from the perspective that there are more Christians in the country, you know, the more voter banks possibly, in terms of the Christian constituent. So what can you say? But yeah, it's very telling. The night before Eid, and I remember families were separated. So we had a meeting literally the day after, whereby some of the members of the Holy Group wanted a conversation. And in fact, the First Minister came on to speak to religious leaders. There was about 5 or 6 of us. And she said, look, it's very sad that some of your family members that are in Manchester are unable to come to Glasgow for Eid. But what can we do? So, you know, and it's difficult. What can you do? It seems, outwardly, it seems like a blatant, you could say, policy of discrimination. That's what it seems like. However, there are complexities involved. So, you know, again, just to support the government now, because I know we've had a good bash at them, but to say that, look, it's unprecedented. It's never happened before. And I'm supporting your position as a member of our Holyrood government. So to come back to support you guys, it's a complex situation. It's unique. It's never happened before. We're doing this together. We're in this together, as they say. And I think really the question comes around public health versus a breach of Article 18. What is the compromise? And as you've heard, juries are allowed to happen, cinemas. So there seems to be a contradiction of the law. There seems to be a weak interpretation when it comes to Article 18 or Article 9 of the ECHR. But my question would be this, that how do we develop a mechanism whereby there is no contradiction, I guess, between the various articles or prioritization of the various articles, but secondly, public health versus freedom of religion? Where do we draw the line? And I think that's a question that needs to continue to be asked. Where do we draw the line? Under public health, are we allowed to suspend religious practices, freedoms, and so forth? Or is there a concession that needs to be made, as was made and will continue to be made? So even if there was another crisis, there will be certain places where there'll be loopholes, there'll be gatherings taking place, there'll be contradictions because, as we know, certain principles have to go forward. But what about faith? What about religion? What about, as they mentioned, in terms of, what was it, spirituality, in terms of observance of certain tenets of faith and belief? Where do we draw the line? How do we interpret this? And that's the question for you politicians. Where do you think that we should draw the line? Or where do you think that we have a case to argue that we should be allowed to go into our centres and mosques? And bearing in mind, some of our congregational prayers were suspended because we need 5 or 10 people. And so, for example, Friday prayers is quite a fundamental principle. And if we're not doing that, it begs to ask a huge question. I guess also there's one more question, and I think there was a lack of understanding of faith. There needs to be some kind of religious literacy that takes place. And as dear Rabbi said, in terms of Whitehall sometimes can be a bit of a bubble, because faith communities have different principles and rules. For Christians, you can go for private prayer. For Muslims, it's very difficult because we pray congregationally. Our congregation are shoulder to shoulder. So there was a point last year where there was about to be a two-tier system. One for Christians who were able to go separate 2 or 3 meters, go into private prayer, and then you've got Muslims. How do you separate Muslims when the whole purpose of praying is in congregation and shoulder to shoulder? So automatically there was a two-tier system that was developed, and I still remember having conversations where I said to the church, we will support your right, even if we're unable to pray. At least somebody should be allowed to pray.
Well,
and I think Herschel was part of some of those conversations.
Herschel, come in on this, because I mentioned not only Ramadan but also Passover. Let's hear your thoughts on that, and then we're going to move on and talk about what we do going forward, because Syed's led us in that direction, and that's the right direction for us to head in now in the webinar as time draws on. Herschel.
I really appreciate Syed's comments, but I want to move away a little bit, if you don't mind, to the core and essential issue. We are tinkering around the edges, but I think we are missing out about what is at the heart of this discussion. And if I may say so, we as religious people have been forced underground. In order for us to engage with society, we have to use a different language, we have to use different terms that society won't think that we are crazy or outside rational discourse. In other words, of course, like Syed said earlier, mental health are essential issues in religion, because God created everyone. So therefore we are all precious, and we have a duty as guardians of our bodies to take due care of our health. But that isn't the sum total of what we're talking here. What we are actually talking about here is that to actually be engaged with God, actually be engaged with religion, actually be engaged with spirituality, actually live a religious life. That if we talk in those terms, I think many of us around the table here, even though we are, I presume, perceived by many out there as being the total fanatics, we are even scared to speak in this forum in terms that are religious, and to declare that religion is essential and important to us, because we are so much under pressure. We are so much under the jackboot of the secular forces that we feel that if we're going to speak in religious terms, we will be considered as total nutcases. And therefore we feel a responsibility, a responsibility to speak in their terms in order to have our voices heard. In other words, they have totally denied us freedom of expression, totally denied us freedom of speech. And I think that this needs a lot of thought, that the very same people, and I'm amongst them, who speak with fervor and with passion about other articles of human rights and decry the government and decry the forces in society who deny human rights for immigrants and for the poor and for the dispossessed. And we say, look, it's human rights. How can you deny people their human rights? How can you lock them up? we are afraid to express that there is another human right, the freedom of religion, which is on the same level as those other human rights. And why is this human right not only not respected, but trampled upon and ignored?
Herschel, very powerfully expressed truisms as far as I'm concerned. You know, I think that's right. I think people of faith, and I certainly count myself as a person of faith, we do temper the terminology we use. We try and reach beyond the boundaries that we feel that we perceive between our spiritual lives and the secular world that we're living in. But I have to say that there are some outstanding examples of people in public life who are prepared to talk about their faith and to talk about their faith openly in terms of spiritual language. And one person that I'm going to highlight in this regard, and she is a political opponent. You know, she serves as the Cabinet Secretary for Finance and the Economy, Kate Forbes, a member of the SNP government. She recently gave an interview where she spoke about her faith and testimony in Jesus Christ as a Christian. And it was a very powerful insight into Kate's motivation. And I found it deeply moving. And I think there are people who are prepared to address this issue on the terms that we as believers, as people of faith, wish to address them, which I think is what you are saying. Let me turn to Lois. Lois, from your vantage point, I mean, this issue about human rights and this hierarchy of human rights. See, I feel very, very strongly that freedom of religion or belief, freedom of conscience, is the parent freedom of all other freedoms. Where that freedom is not respected in any setting, none of the other freedoms are valid. None of them are in operation. It is like the crowning freedom of freedoms from which all the other freedoms flow. So what do we do in the United Kingdom? I think the pandemic has revealed some concerns which we're sharing with one another. But what do we do? What do we do as people of faith? What do we do as communities of faith? And what do we ask government to do differently in order to reset this relationship that there needs to be between people of faith, communities of faith, and the society we live in, and government, and parliament, and the law? Big question, Lois.
Very big
You've got
question.
60 seconds.
Well, first of all, I do agree with you that freedom of religion and belief, and I think also a freedom of speech as well, which is quite an attached right. These really are the human rights about expressions of who we are as people. It's really our essence as human beings, isn't it? And what we believe in our conscience and what we can't violate about our conscience. So I do agree that they are kind of cornerstones of that. And to pick up just very briefly on what Herschel was saying, and I want to make it clear that I don't think that religious people were asking for more than what is equal to everybody else. The freedom of religion and belief is equal to every other human right. And if other people were allowed to open their businesses, to attend other public places, religious people, they're not more contagious than everyone else. They just wanted equal rights. And that's what this is all about, really. So I think I think the cases that went forward in Scotland, and there was some that went forward in England, and unfortunately the courts dithered and delayed so much that they became what's called a moot point, and they were not heard properly before a decision was not made. But being vocal, whether it's as much as Canon Tom and bringing the government to court, or whether it's speaking out in the media or just making the case really clear, because if we don't speak about our human right to freedom of religion and belief, if we're just quiet, then that will be eroded. People won't think that it matters. People won't think that anybody cares. So it's really important if there's a decision like that coming up, if there's a situation like that again, writing to MPs, I mean, you can tell me more, Stephen, yourself, but writing to MPs can make a huge difference to have your voice heard. Advocating, making sure that these things are discussed in public, and that we don't shy away from something just because it might be a bit awkward, or we might feel that a bit embarrassed about talking about our religion and belief. We have to get over that. That is it's our fundamental human right, not only to hold our beliefs privately, but publicly, and to share them and to celebrate them together. So making sure we do that and we hold on to those freedoms, that if we are allowed to meet, and if you feel comfortable to do so with your health, meet, go and do it, enjoy your freedom, make the most of it, and make sure that there won't be a situation again where it isn't seen to be important.
And what about that? I love what you've said, by the way. I love this idea of sharing our beliefs, celebrating our beliefs, talking about our beliefs. I think that's very powerful. What about engaging with government and government's response to faith groups?
Well, there's obviously participation opportunities in terms of consultations, etc. Sayed mentioned earlier that the Scottish government had put out a consultation, and there were several faith leaders, many faith leaders who did contribute. So there is ways to contribute, and there's, as you mentioned, Stephen, there is members of Parliament who are open about their protection of religion and belief. So having an eye on that, having an eye on what's coming in the political scene, and making sure you're aware of those opportunities to engage can really make a huge difference. But also, if you, Canon Tom is a priest in Glasgow, and he just felt that there was something wrong and he did something about it. And so these cases can take place. And there's Christian groups like ADF UK, like others, and there's groups of all different faiths who are able and willing to support and to help. So don't be afraid to make sure that you're able to go and make your voice heard, whether that's in front of a court or in front of a press conference or in front of the government. Yeah, go out and do it.
Sayed, you've been doing this. I know that you're very involved with government, and you are proactive in this respect. You're living what Herschel was talking about in terms of dialogue and speaking about spiritual things in the context of the secular world we live in. What do you think we need to do to reset the relationship between faith groups and government so that there's more spiritual literacy in Westminster and in Holyrood and Cardiff Bay and Stormont?
I think individually it becomes difficult, especially as minority communities, because you are afraid of a backlash. But I think the way forward is coalition, is together. And it's very powerful when you find this togetherness, where you may have, let's say, Jews, Christians, Muslims standing side by side, having that conversation. The Dharmic faith, for example, Buddhist, Hindus, Sikhs. It's very powerful that when there's the perception that religion divides, and then all of a sudden you see religious leaders united or religious representatives united having a conversation. I think there's great power to that. And I think that what that leads to is then a normalization of faith within politics, and I think within the public space. And that's what's required. Normalization of religion or faith or terminology, spiritual language within the public space, within government. But the only way I can see it work, and what has worked for us, is a coalition. It's when people come together. It's when you see the vicar, the rabbi, the imam together, standing together, advocating for one another, supporting each other. And then when they put forward their wants and asks, I think at that stage, government feels obliged, I would say almost, to listen. So individually, it's difficult, especially as a minority community. You may feel that there's a backlash, you may feel targeted, you may feel that because of which it could lead to a rise in bigotry, xenophobia. But when you're standing together, shoulder to shoulder, having those conversations with government, I think that is very powerful. And we've seen examples of this, not just in the UK, but across Europe. When faith communities do come together, it's powerful. And I think that's the only way forward. That you'll always find allies within government because they're people of faith within government. Government, you'll find people from all spectrums are there, not just from one particular line. So when members of government see that there's a coalition of faith representation, it bolsters their own faith to say, yes, let's talk to you, let's support you, let's be there for you. It gives them the confidence then to go and pitch what faith communities would like them to pitch. So if we are to go forward, it needs to be together, it needs to be in coalition and unity. And at the same time, we mustn't stop dialogue with the government, regardless of how one may feel that our freedoms are being trampled over. But the minute that you stop that dialogue, it means that channel stops. It means that we stop presenting our needs and wants to a democratic government. They're meant to be representative. They're meant to represent us. They're meant to listen to our voices. So I think the one thing that I would say to at least my communities, don't ever give up. Keep that dialogue, keep that channel open. It's respectable, it's the way that our democracy works. But at the same time, let's continue to build our coalitions, our alliances, our friendships. And as friends, people of various faiths, we can go forward, united, and have those conversations. And I think that's really what the future is. And I think that's how I'd like to continue if I'm going to be impactful.
Sayed, I reflect on my experience as a member of Parliament, and you're absolutely right. There are people of faith, of all faiths, across all parties, and there's so much common ground, and there's so much scope for politicians of faith to work together. And therefore, there are people in public life, in public service, who are very open to this dialogue and are very willing to speak up themselves. Kate Forbes, I mentioned, Theresa May, you mentioned Sayed earlier on as a person of faith. And can I just say that one of the most moving, you talked about consideration of each other in coalition, one of the most moving things that you said this morning, and I shall remember this for a very long time, was when you talked about prayer, about how the Islamic tradition of prayer is to be shoulder to shoulder, and how there was going to be an accommodation around prayer. And you said, well, we will support these other faiths that they may pray because somebody needs to pray. And I think that was a beautiful thing to say. I'm going to turn to Herschel. We're coming to the end, Herschel. We're going to have some final comments from everyone before we conclude. But Herschel, on this question of resetting the relationship, of engaging with government, what are your thoughts?
I thank you very much, Sayed, for your comments, which you know I feel very passionate about. I do agree that we are seeing green shoots. We're seeing younger people expressing a much stronger and much more in-your-face belief in God. But I do not think, sadly, that we've turned the corner yet.
Mm-hmm.
As we've said, that even that I do know that very many people in Westminster and Whitehall are people of faith and deep faith, but they feel that they have to be in deep undercover to survive in those circumstances. And as we sadly saw with the previous DUP leader and a recent Liberal Democrat leader in Westminster, that because of their faith, they were hounded out of their position. And the Liberal Democrat leader, when he was unshackled from being the leader of the party, said that he was very sorry that he had to deny things which he believes passionately in, because of he felt that being in Westminster, he didn't have a choice. So that is indicative of the atmosphere and the situation that many politicians find themselves in. And that also has a very strong weight upon legislation, that they're afraid to counter anti-religious legislation in case their cover will be broken. So it's a situation that needs urgent attention. But I am an optimist, and I'm a strong optimist, and I think that we all have to work together. People from all backgrounds, to change the situation, not to change the situation, to reveal the true situation and enable people to have the right of expression and of being themselves.
That's inspiring listening to you talk about that. And I think people of faith in public life absolutely do need to speak up, come from being undercover, as you put it. And be able to be a witness in their own terms of the things that they hold as precious and have not just temporal but everlasting value. I'm going to ask every one of you now, literally, I'm going to go back to my 60 seconds. Just take a moment, summarize what you feel about what you've heard today, how useful this discussion may have been from your perspective, and a little bit about what you hope. That's about 20 seconds for every one of those different things. Lois, you go first, would you?
I'd love to. And I think I can roll all those three things into one. And I think this is a really hopeful moment for people of faith in the UK. And the reason is because I think the government did overstep, it went too far. And a lot of people have acknowledged that. And now we have an open space for conversation I don't think there was before, where we can talk about the fact that there was overstep in freedom of religion and belief and what that looks like and how we can prevent that happening again. And like has been a common theme in the last 15 minutes of what we've all been talking about, I think there's a great truth in alliance building and standing with other people who are experiencing the same thing and going to the government and saying this is affecting all of these people who are your constituents, who are your people that you have to protect the rights of. So there's a conversation open just now, and it's freedom of religion and belief, it's freedom of protest, it's freedom of speech. And these are all things that are before Parliament, both in Scotland and in Westminster. So I think this is a time to really make sure that we are impacting those conversations as a voice of faith communities and saying, we are important, our rights matter as much as everyone else does, and we are here to speak into the situation and make sure the outcome is something that respects the rights of everybody.
Lois, that was a beautiful summary. Sayed.
I've said this conversation gives me a lot of hope. The fact that we're not alone. You've just heard diverse voices, and that really bolsters morale, that we're not alone in this. We've got support, we've got friends, we've got people who are willing also to help and to work together. And so I think it's also opened up, at least in this country, a discussion in terms of interpretation. We've got now the guts to challenge, as we have done. In Scotland, they want that challenge. So it's open to challenge. So sometimes I guess the Muslim community feels that it has to sit down and shut up. But it's not a wrong thing to challenge the government within the boundaries, within our democratic boundaries. So I think the other thing of hope is alliance building. But there's something that Rabbi Herschel said that saddened me, and that is that within government, if our representatives feel that they have to be quiet in certain aspects, or you could say that their pluralism has been curtailed, as peoples of faith, they're not allowed to express themselves, then that's saddening in the 21st century, that we're meant to be the bastion of pluralism, of expression, of freedom of conscience. And you've got serious leaders, representatives, who feel undermined and who feel that they can't express themselves because there's a particular culture, and to use the rabbi's words, of secularism, that where we can't breach. So I think that that's a realization, that's something saddening for me. But with that, there's a lot of hope. And I guess this is the hope, this diversity, these people, we together, I believe, can make a difference. And that's the hope going forward.
Thank you so much. Herschel, you get the final word from our guests.
Thank you. I think this is a Braveheart moment, being Scottish. In other words, that we have expressed today in clear, unequivocal terms that the emperor has no clothes, and we are capable of saying that you who speak in the name of Western values, you who speak in the name of universal Declaration of Human Rights, are you real? Are you for real? Are you really living according to those values? Or are you hiding behind those values? And I think that conversation we need to have the conversation, and we need to have the conversation with determination and confidence that we see the reality, and we will, please God, be able to bring about positive change for everyone.
Herschel, thank you so much. Thank you to Lois. Thank you to Sayed. And this has been a tremendous, it's gone very quickly, by the way. I think I lost track of the time. I do apologize. It's been so worthwhile for me to have listened to each of you and your contributions. I have felt inspired by what you have shared with us this morning. I've been had reasons for concern, but above all else, I feel absolutely inspired. This is what Freedom Declared Foundation is all about. It is about declaring that fundamental freedom of religion or belief, which is been the subject of this webinar, as it has been the subject of our previous webinar. Freedom Declared Foundation is for all faiths and for people of no faith at all. Such is the importance of this fundamental human right. We hope that you've enjoyed, if you've been inspired, as I have been, by what you've heard, that you will subscribe, like, follow our media output on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, and that you'll also visit our website, details of which are below this this video. Again, thank you to my guests, and thank you for all of you for watching. Until we meet again, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.